Good evening. Thank you for joining Gwinnett County Public Library for our Authors and Dessert series featuring Professor Marisela Martinez-Cola, author of The Bricks Before Brown. My name is Miriam Mayer, and I am an Adult Services Specialist for Gwinnett County Public Library. Our speaker tonight will discuss her book, and then we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. Her book is also available for sale, and she will be signing copies after the program. Now I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Marisela Martinez-Cola is an assistant professor of sociology at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and her law degree from Loyola University Chicago School of Law. She earned her PhD at Emory University. For 10 years, she served as the Director of Multicultural Affairs at a variety of institutions, including the George Washington University, the University of Georgia, and Agnes Scott College. Her first book, The Bricks Before Brown, is the product of her dissertation and a dream come true. She hopes she can serve as an example that it is never too late to follow your dreams. Please welcome Professor Marisela Martinez-Cola.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for those of you who came out tonight, and I'm so excited to be able to share about my book this evening. So let's get going. Why not? So I always like to tell my students, I always give an agenda, like this is where we're going to be. This is our roadmap for the night. So first I'll just give a brief introduction of myself, because I think it helps for the author to know who the author is and where they came from to really understand how the book developed. Then I'll give a little bit of the book's background, like where it came from. Then I'll talk about chapter 1, which is the theoretical foundations of the book. Go on to chapter 2, that tells a little bit of the history of all the cases that came before Brown. And then my favorite part, chapters 3, 4, and 5, where I get a chance to share the stories of the families that I focus on in this book in particular. So, and then of course Q&A. So, all right. Quick introduction, a little bit about myself. So I am from Battle Creek, Michigan. Okay, and Battle Creek, Michigan hosts Kellogg's cereal company, for those of you who don't know that. So it is called the cereal capital of the world. And that's what we're our claim to fame. And so I always tell my students that I'm the original frosted mini wheat. I'm fun on one side, serious on the other. And so I grew up there. My mother is from Reynosa, Mexico, and my father is from Donna, Texas. And I just tell people they either threw a dart or they really like cereal to end up there. And so I call myself a Michicana, a Chicana from Michigan, is sort of my background. Now, I'm the first in my family to go to college. So I went to the University of Michigan for my undergrad, and I majored in psychology and African Studies. Absolutely loved my time there. And when you're a first-generation college student, there's 4 things you're supposed to do. One of the 4 things that you're supposed to do. You're supposed to either become a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or go in business, right? I stunk at math and science, so that knocked 3 of them out right away. But I could argue well, and so they said, Marisela, you should go to law school. So I said, sure, let me go to law school. So I went to Loyola University Chicago School of Law. And I loved the study of law, but I hated the practice of it, like just to my bones hated it. And I was miserable for about a year working in the law until an opportunity came up when I was moving from one city to another. And I got an interview with a law firm, a really wonderful law firm. And I got an interview with a small college to be their diversity director. And so I accepted the position as diversity director, and I didn't look back. And so for about 10 years, I worked in an area called multicultural affairs. And that's where I got a chance to be able to advise students that were at a lot of these universities who were sort of trying to make their own way in the college. And so that's really where, honestly, a big part of this book came from. Because one time during the Black History Month celebration, the students came up to me, the Latino students and Asian American students that attended the event loved the event. And they came up to me, they said, Marisela, that was so great, but can we ask you a question? And we said, yeah, of course. I said, did we do anything? Meaning, did Latinos or Asian Americans do anything? Or did we just sit on the sidelines? And I said, of course you did something. Absolutely you did something. Just give me a minute, I'll find it. And so I ended up starting with the Brown v. Board, and I had a little bitty folder where I started to put all of the information on there. And I began, whenever I told a story, I began telling them across the 4 major racial groups. So I would look at something, and I would look at it through how it was presented in Black communities, in Latin American, in Latino communities, in Asian American communities, and in Native American communities. And so that's kind of how I developed as a scholar. So during that time, of course, I met my best friend, and I married him. He was amazing. I love my husband. His name's Greg. And we had a beautiful son, David. And when David went to school, I said, now Mama's going to school, because I always wanted to get my PhD. And because I wanted to go from the administrative side of the house at a college to the academic side of the house. And I couldn't do that unless I got a PhD. So I went to Emory University. Now, in a really great full circle moment, at the University of Michigan, I had this amazing mentor named Dr. Earl Lewis. He was a historian, and he hired me as a research assistant. And I got very, very close to him. Fast forward all those years later, and he was provost at Emory University. And so he was able to help me get in and find my way there when I was there. So after I graduated from Emory, I worked at Utah State University in Logan, Utah. Yes, Logan, Utah. And I was there, and they were very good to me. And I remember I told them, I said, I'm a very loyal person. You've got me. I'm here. I said, unless Morehouse calls. Because during my graduate school years, I did a fellowship year at Morehouse College, and I fell in love with it. And I thought, this is where I need to come back. And I didn't think that was going to happen for several years. And lo and behold, after 3 years at Utah State, my friend calls me and said, were you serious about coming back to Morehouse? And I was like, absolutely. And so called me, and now I'm back here at Morehouse. And this is really my dream job. And I'm really, really thrilled there. So, Morehouse. And right now it's homecoming week at Morehouse, so lots of really good energy going on. It's going to be my first football game. I'm so excited about it. So what's the background of the book? When we think about segregation, right, these are some of the popular images that pop up whenever we talk about school desegregation, right? Usually there's one of children. I don't know if you remember that middle one up top. That was, the woman was yelling 2468, we don't want to integrate to her. That was one of the Little Rock Nine. And so this is the imagery that I think whenever we talk about segregation happens, right? And so what is it that tells you? Usually that segregation is limited to the 50s, right? People think of it as happening in the 1950s, but they also think of it as located just in the South, and that it's a struggle between black and white. The division is black and white. So that's it. That's the storyline. That's the narrative that's out there when you think about school desegregation or segregated schooling. And of course, the most famous case, even my international students know Brown v. Board of Education, happened in 1954. And that's the case, of course, that struck down the doctrine of separate but equal, and had determined that separate is unequal, and overruled what was the Plessy decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, right? And so this happened in 1954. And so I had a question when I was looking at this research. So you have 1896, which is when Plessy versus Ferguson was found, and that's the separate but equal doctrine was created. And then, of course, you had 1954. Those are the two main dates. But I thought, what happened in between, right? There had to have been something that happened in between. And one of the other questions I asked, I said, were there any Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans involved? Did they file any cases? Because I know the way the law works. And if you're part of a group, you're going to say, yeah, that counts for me too. And so I completely expected to see those cases around 1954. And to my amazement, they ended up starting in the late 1800s with the Chinese American case, to the 1920s with the Native American case, to the 1940s with the Mexican American case. And so I'm hoping that you'll be able to see the connections that I was able to see throughout this. There's a wonderful movie out there called The Sixth Sense. And the little kid says, I see dead people. I see them everywhere. And I don't see dead people, but I tell people I see connections. I see them everywhere. I can't help but see them. So before we go into the history of it, one of the things that's really important is just to kind of lay the theoretical foundation, give you sort of the lens through which you'll be able to see the rest of the book. And these are just kind of some of the contributions that I gave, I believe, to the field when you think about it. The first is this idea that really most of the knowledge that we have, I call this Black foundationalism. And the reason why I call it that is because even for myself, but many of the scholarship on race today wouldn't have been possible without the Black scholars that really helped to lay a tremendous foundation for the rest of us to start to have those inquiries. And so one of the growths out of Black foundationalism and that literature is, of course, critical race theory, right? Which is a really big buzzword now, right? Really big controversies around. And I always joke around and tell people, well, if they're bugging out about critical race theory, wait till they find out there's branches, you know? And so what happens is that each group ends up saying there's something that critical race theory didn't capture about our experience. And so I use Lat crit, Asian crit, and tribal crit to look at these cases. But then there's all these other ones. There's Desi crit, and that's South Asians born in the US. There's Dis crit, so that's disability studies and race studies put together. And queer crit, and looks at LGBTQ plus and race together. And they're each kind of saying there's stuff that you didn't consider when this was initially created, right? And another contribution that I feel like I'm making is this particular table. These are the tenets of critical race theory, Lat crit, Asian crit, and tribal crit. And it's one of the first times you can see them put side by side to be able to see what are the connections and what are the critical connections, but also what are the meaningful differences that happen across. And so, for example, one of the things you can tell is that one thing CRT didn't take into account, critical race theory didn't take into account, was language, right? Or being bilingual. And that's something, of course, that affects Asian American populations and Mexican American or Latino populations. And the other thing that it hadn't considered really was this idea of immigration and the impact of immigration. And so that's sort of the ability to kind of tell their stories, but there are some similarities across them. And when you look at tribal crit, for example, there was no way that critical race theory could have anticipated the idea of being a nation within a nation. And what is that like for Native Americans to be a sovereign nation within a nation? And the identity of having a racial identity as Native Americans, but also a political identity as Native Americans, right? So I created this as well just to be able to show who were some of the founding authors, what were the significant cases, some of the treaties and legislation, which are the organizations that most people sort of have maybe not heard about, and what are the unique issues to each particular group. And then here at the bottom are the aligned interest, right? And one of my favorite things is they all have storytelling, is one of my favorite aspects. They all have an aspect of storytelling and saying that the power of being able to tell your own story in your own words. And so I get an opportunity to share those stories with this. The other thing that I add to this is this idea of controlling images. That's something that was a concept created, a theoretical concept created by Patricia Hill Collins, right? And controlling images, kind of think of it like stereotypes on steroids, so with power, right? And it's basically the idea of what are the images that are out there in culture that help to kind of control the way that we think about certain populations, right? And one of the things that I saw as I was looking at the young girls, they were all young girls, by the way, that were the plaintiffs, and I'll tell you more about them in the middle, is the idea that you had three kind of images floating around in all of their time periods, from the 1800s to the 1940s, right? And they were either sexualized or criminalized, was one side, or they were made sort of pathetic or inferior, right? And each of them have their own kind of thing. So back in the 1800s, Chinese American women were seen as prostitutes at the time, and they were also seen as pagans, sort of, godless and needing to be saved through Christianity. You have, with Native Americans, the S word, squaw, which is a racial slur. And I don't know if you all noticed that there's, what they're doing, there's a movement now to change all the names of rivers and mountains that have this word in it, to be able to change that, or savages. For Mexican Americans, you have something called Malinches, which are, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the zoot suit. You know, it's a suit that used a lot of fabric in the 1940s. That wasn't a good thing because they were trying to ration, right? And so it was seen as very unpatriotic. And so for you to be kind of around there, you're kind of a bad girl, you know, is sort of what is considered, very criminalized. And of course, mamacita. There was an actress at the time, Lupe Velez, who was sort of the female version of Denny Arnaz, right? And so she had a very, very thick accent, but she was in a lot of comedies, and she had a lot of films called Mexican Spitfire. You know, Mexican Spitfire does this, and Mexican Spitfire does that, you know? And whenever I think about Mamacitas and how long that lasts, I try to think of Gloria from Modern Family, you know, the recent episode. She's very much in that sort of controlling image. And on the other sides, you know, Chinese children were seen as poor creatures that were basically, you know, servants in households, or they were orphaned was the other thing. The sacrificial maiden is this idea that it was in films, that there was always this female character, Native American woman, who would sort of sacrifice herself for her people to be able to help the white individuals that were in the movies, right? And then, of course, you have in lots of the literature at the time, Mexican children were called mentally inferior, you know, at the time. And so the argument I made is that these young girls were too young to be sexualized or criminalized, but they were too middle class to be seen as pathetic or inferior. And so they held this really interesting middling position on the inside. So the next part of it talks about all of the cases. And so I ended up creating this map that shows you, so what do you get from this map? What do you see from that? You see that it's not just in the South. Look at its distribution. It is all around the country. Look at Kansas. Kansas has 10 cases alone that begin in 1881, right? So it's not just the Brown cases, because that's where Brown came from, was in Kansas, right? And so look at some of these places. Missouri had 6 cases. California had 7. And so it started really in Massachusetts in 1848 with a young girl named Sarah Roberts. And so it was a young girl named Sarah Roberts, and who was her abolitionist father. And what I really love about this story is you discover that the school desegregation movement started with a little black girl and her abolitionist father, and ended with a little black girl and her activist father. You know, that connection was just so beautiful. So these are all the cases that happened. You know, the ones with stars are part of the Brown case, because there were actually 5 cases that were put into one under Brown v. Board. A lot of people don't know that. And the ones with triangles had non-black plaintiffs. And there were 5 cases involving Native Americans, 4 cases involving Chinese Americans, and 2 cases involving Mexican Americans, right? So a total of 11. And so if you look here in the South, one of the things that's really fascinating is the Chinese cases, the Chinese American cases, were split between California and Mississippi, of all places. And there is a really large, fairly large Chinese Delta Mississippi population that's there that were grocers at the time. And so that's the population that came in. There's a wonderful book called Chopsticks in the Land of Cotton that really, really talks about that history. And then you've got, of course, the West and Midwest areas as well. So on to the next, and this is really, those first 2 chapters are good if you really want sort of the history and you want the theoretical framework. But it's also something you can kind of skip if that's not really your thing, because you're more interested in actually getting to know the stories and the plaintiffs. And so what I did is I pulled out, there's 3 cases in particular that all were based in California, that I got a chance to tell the story, not just of California, but what was going on at those particular times. So the first one is Tape versus Hurley. And this happened in 1885, and this is the Tape family. So the father, his name is Joe Tape, or Joseph Tape, but his Chinese name is Chu Diep, right? But they Americanized it to Joe Tape, right? The mother is Mary Tape, who was actually part of an orphanage, and she took on the name of the Irish matron. So she was Mary McGladdery before she met Joseph Tape. And so they got married and ended up having these 3 children, Emily, who's sitting on Joseph's lap, Mamie, who is the lead plaintiff in the case, and then their brother Frank. And there's so much, I talk about this photograph so much in this particular chapter. So here's kind of basically their story. It's going to sound a little familiar, right? So Joseph Tape is trying to enroll his daughter into the school closest to their home. So they go to the school, and the school brutally rebuffs her, right? Because she's not white. And so the Tape family, and I don't know if you can tell from this, were a pretty wealthy family. They had money, so they sued, right? Because you're going to need to have money if you're going to have a lawsuit like that, right? And so they sued the school, and they won. They won the case. That's what's so amazing about it. Because the judge said, and here's the side part to it. The judge said, the way the law is written right now, you have to accept her, because it says all children must go to public school. But, wink, wink, if you get the legislation changed, you can do whatever it is that you want. And so they delayed her admission for a variety, from one reason to another, until they were able to pass legislation that created Chinese schools in California, in San Francisco specifically. And so they ended up passing the law that created the Chinese schools, and they opened up a Chinese school for 5 Chinese American children. And Mamie Tape and her brother were among them. And one of the things that I love when they describe her on her school day, they describe her so beautifully. She had white stockings and a really pretty dress. And then they said an enormous plume, an impressive plume that came from her hat. And I just imagined myself, when I was researching this, I imagined Mary, her mother, dressing her for that day, knowing that she was going to be on display, because they were written about in the paper quite frequently at the time, right? One of the other things that happened is the school board didn't really get off that easily, right? So the mother, Mary Tape, writes this letter to the school board, and it ends up getting published in the newspaper. And this letter is amazing. And she's basically telling them, you are race prejudiced men. How dare you do this to my child? I mean, it's just, when I first found the letter, I tell my students, you need to find something that gives you research goosebumps, and that's what I ended up finding. And so I love sharing the content of that particular letter, just to see, I think hopefully any mother that reads it would know, yeah, I get that, connection. And so that's the Tape versus Hurley case. And the next one is Piper versus Big Pine. And this happened in the 1920s, right? Right about that time, what was happening is that the Indian boarding schools, a lot of them were closing, right? Those were created, it said, to kill the savage and save the man. That was its premise with the Indian boarding schools, right? But it was a failure ultimately, and so they ended up closing a lot of the boarding schools. So that meant there were a lot of Native children who were now needing to go to schools, to the public schools, right? And so in this particular case, the school district was creating a new school and had promised the Paiute families that they could go to the school. Well, sure enough, after it was built, they started to create different rules. There was a 3-mile radius that they had to live between in order to attend the school, and guess what? Many of the Native children didn't. Many of the Paiute children didn't live, so that we're trying to keep them out of the school. So then again, this family, the Piper family, sued the school, right? Now, what's really interesting about this one is that there's actually 2 stories to this, right? When you read the opinion of this particular case, what it looks like is that they argued under the Dawes Act that they were American citizens. And because they were American citizens, they were entitled to the education, right? But under the Dawes Act, the language is they had to adopt civilized habits. And that meant having to move off of the reservation, right? And there were a variety of other sort of requirements, but basically to assimilate, right? Fully, in order to be able to then be declared a U.S. citizen. So when you read the opinion of the case, it sounds like basically the Piper family sold out. That's what it looks like. But this is where I think it's really important. Stories become really important. So there's 2 stories. There's the people, there's the paper, and then the people. And so when I asked the individuals, the historians there at the Paiute tribe, sure enough, they did not, deny their Paiute heritage. In fact, they did not move off of the reservation. Alice Piper lived there to a ripe old age. She's buried in their cemetery, and so it was kind of a ruse, right? to be able to get into the school. And so that's one of the really wonderful stories I love about that. A moment that I had in this particular case, so for years, all I had was the picture of her face. So on this statue, it's the only memorial that I know of to a school desegregation case, and it's a life-size statue of her. And so they basically only had her face. And so for years, all I had was this tiny little square that showed Alice's face. And when I went to go speak to the people that helped to tell me the story, right? When I said there was a wonderful collage of photographs that was mysteriously left by the statue, right? And it was a collage of Alice and her life. And so I see this picture of her, and she's older, and she's beautiful. And I was like, is this Alice? And they were like, yeah, that's her. And so I started to cry because I only had this 15-year-old girl in my mind for all those years to finally be able to see her grown up. And I ended up doing more research on her life after that, as well. So you'll get to hear almost a full story of Alice's life. I'm still doing research, but that's her story. Then, of course, you have Mendez v. Westminster, which was a Mexican-American case that happened in the 1940s. And I give a lot of background about what happened at that particular time as well. And as you know, is World War II really was a really big thing. Now, Mexicans at the time were considered legally white, right? And so a lot of people don't know that. They were legally considered white. And so let me tell you the story first. I'm sorry, I get a little ahead of myself. All right, so this is what happens with the Mendez family. So they are going to enroll into the school, closest to their home. And so the auntie takes the cousins, there's 2 cousins, and then the 3 Mendez children, right? Takes them to the school to go and enroll them. And the administrator says, we'll take them, but we won't take those, pointing to the Mendez children. And the issue is that the cousins were light-skinned, and they did not have a Spanish last name, And then the Mendez children were fairly dark-skinned. In fact, the mother described them as prieto, like como yo, dark like me, because the mother is Puerto Rican and Mexican. And so she has had darker skin. And then, so it was really a colorism issue. And so, of course, the auntie wasn't having any of this. So she goes back to the home, and she talks to Gonzalo, the father, and explains what happens. And then they end up suing the school. Now, he was running a farm at the time, and there's a really fascinating story about how they got the farm that is also in the book. But they ended up getting the farm, and that was allowed them to fund the lawsuit, right? And so he went around and recruited 5,000 families from 5 different school districts to be able to join and encourage them to join the lawsuit. They ended up getting an attorney named David Marcus, and what he did, he had previously won a pool desegregation case. They were segregating the pools in California. What they would do is all the white families would use the pools. They had Mexican Mondays, and that's when they would allow the Mexican families to swim. They would drain the pool and then refill it up again. And so he ended up winning that case. And so that's how he got connected to the Mendez family. And so what was really fascinating is that a lot of people think that the Mendez family were trying to claim that they were white, right? Because under the law they were. And they did not file it as a racial discrimination lawsuit because white people can't discriminate against white people, right? So the attorney was brilliant in his argument and said, no, they are being discriminated against based on descent, right? But the way that they talk about it, it's completely racialized language, the way that they discuss it. And so while the family is running through the court system, the mother, Felicitas, is running the farm. She's absolutely brilliant. And then she starts a parent organization and it helps cart the families back and forth to the courtroom so they'll know what's happening and continue to pay the employees so that they wouldn't lose their money while the lawsuit was going on. So they win the case, right? But the school then appeals it, right, to the Ninth Circuit. Now, the Ninth Circuit is right below the Supreme Court, right? And so they win it at the Ninth Circuit. Now, the school, if they would have appealed, this would have gone to the Supreme Court. But one of the reasons why it didn't is because the governor, after they won the second time, integrated all the schools in California, so it became a moot point, right? And a lot of people think that it's been, the story is that Brown versus Board of Education was the first one to use experts to talk about the effect that it had on children, but it was actually Mendez. And so the attorneys, Robert Carter from the NAACP, met with David Marcus, the attorney with Mendez, and said, we want to use your skeleton to be able to argue Brown. And so, and the NAACP wrote what they call an amicus brief on behalf of this case. So there was that really awesome kind of black-brown connection that I love to talk about. But my favorite part of it is that the governor of California, his name just happened to be Earl Warren. Earl Warren went on to become Chief Justice Earl Warren of the Supreme Court, and guess what his first case was? Brown versus Board of Education. So that's a really, really, I think, a beautiful moment that I thoroughly enjoy with the families. One of the things that I really want to be able to, and I'll end this with the way that I begin the book. It's one of my favorite poems of all times from Langston Hughes. And it's I Too Sing America. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. And this is what I love about being able to tell the stories, is they too were America. They were a critical part of really what made this country the way that it is, you know, the way that people fought. And so I can tell my students, yes, you did do something. No, you didn't sit on the sidelines. And that actually tells a really beautiful story. And thank you for letting me share it with you all tonight. So thank you. So I'll open it up for Q&A now. And if you'd like, I do have, I can put these up if you want to write them down. It's ways that you can get the book if you're not able to get it tonight. This is a QR code that gives you 30% off. And if you want an autographed copy, you can email me. And I have business cards that I can give you as well. And of course, you can buy it at Amazon. So thank you. So any questions? Yes?
Out of curiosity, what did you do your dissertation?
This book.
This book, okay.
Yeah, this is a book. What was, you know, when you go to graduate school, it's so really funny. It takes a moment. A lot of my fellow students who were younger would come into grad school and they would change their topic like every day, sometimes it looked like. And I came in with this topic and I left with this topic. And so I refused to let it go. They actually told me, you know, Marisela, you're doing 3 dissertations in one. You could just pick one case and talk about it. And I was like, no, I don't want to. They said, okay, well, maybe you should consider getting rid of the Native American case, you know, because that's going to be the hardest one to research. And I said, absolutely not. I need to be able to tell all 3 stories together. And it will not make any sense if I take that out. And so, yeah, so that's how I ended up doing that. Yes?
Were all 3 cases in federal court, or were some in state court?
Yeah, what happened is some of them went to the state Supreme Court and then went into the federal appellate system, and then others went into through the federal district. So you can go through the state or the federal. And so yeah, the way that the cases got included in that 105 is that they were published opinions. So there are actually more Mexican American cases. They just didn't have published opinions and didn't come up in my search when I looked at this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
I would like to know what are you going to work on next?
Yes, thank you for asking. So one of my next project is I've already got the title of the book when I have it. It's called Otherwise We'd Cry. And I'm going to be talking to multiracial groups of comedians and interviewing them and asking them how they joke about race. And so it's going to be all the different, I want it to be white comedians, black comedians, Latino comedians, Middle Eastern comedians, you know, just all types, because I just want to find out. I am fascinated with comedians because they're kind of, you know, our lay sociologists. They're able to, in a joke, in just a really small bit, explain something that it would take me weeks to explain to the students. And so I use clips a lot in my classes when I teach. So that's where that comes from. Yeah. That was my next. Yes?
In your book, do you address the Native American children in the Catholic Church? schools?
No. Yeah, no. I mentioned the history of it, but I don't go into depth about, what it is. But I talk about sort of the education options that were available to the Native American students at the time. Yeah. Absolutely. Anything else? No? Yes.
What do you teach at Morehouse?
At Morehouse, I teach sociology. Yeah, so right now I'm teaching contemporary social theory, which is a lot of fun. I teach criminology and another class called social problems. So I teach 3 courses every semester, although next semester I'm not going to be teaching because I'm actually, let me see if I can go all the way back. So, this map, I got a grant to turn this into a digital interactive map that I'm creating for social studies teachers to be able to share with kids, so they'll be able to click on a case, click on any one of these cases, and be able to see photographs, videos, archival material, newspaper accounts, things like that, so they can be able to see that, because I want kids to see themselves making history. And so I'll be working a lot on that next semester, to get that going. So yeah, it's fun.
Can you go back to that map of the, why do you think there's no cases in that middle swath of the U.S.?
Yeah, I know, right? It's just, I think that one of the reasons why, what's interesting is there are cases that happened at that particular time, but they weren't appealed or weren't into the federal system to be able to actually be counted, in there. So there were cases that had them. So that's one of the hard part. I didn't get a chance to get all of all of them. But the fact that there were just even 100 cases that a lot of people don't know about, I thought was really, interesting. But yeah, that's and I think the other reason why is when you look at where they are located, they had larger populations, in those locations. So much more multiracial populations in all those areas.
What about Georgia? I think that's interesting that there's no number in Georgia.
Yeah, exactly. And there's, we have some very famous cases that came. A lot of them were they're either post-Brown or right around Brown that happened.
Yeah, Florida.
6. Yeah, exactly. Keeping up with the tradition of Florida, right? That Florida. Yeah, yes.
When you're doing your research, do you think you're going to be hampered? I've heard comedians say now that they don't tell racial jokes anymore.
Right.
They don't go on college campuses because everybody's going to be offended.
Yes, very, very much afraid of it.
Heard your research somewhere?
I think that one of the things that I'm going to be doing is I'm actually going to, thanks to YouTube, many of their bits are already up there. So I'm going to ask them about very specific bits that they talk about and say, how did you come up with that? So I'll be coming in with questions about particular and specific bits that they talk about. The challenging part for me, honestly, is how I'm going to be able to maintain anonymity. Because comedians all know each other's jokes, right? And so if I talk about a particular joke, they're going to know which comedian it is that I'm talking about. But this is also a population that doesn't mind their name being attached to something, right? But yeah, I think that while they stopped going on college campuses, many of them are still telling those jokes in sort of more open spaces like in New York or LA and some of these other areas. But the biggest challenge, honestly, that I had, and I was going to start this was supposed to be started during the pandemic, was that comedians have very tragic lives, tremendously tragic lives. And they have just there are a lot of really sad stories. I was concerned with the depression, and I was like, I don't need to be talking to depressed people right now during the pandemic. And so that's why I kind of held it off a little bit till now. I'm in a better space myself to be able to do that. So yeah, but I'm confident I can get them talking about it. Yeah.
What did you say you did at Utah State?
At Utah State, I taught sociology there as well. Yeah, that was my first job out of grad school, was doing that. Yeah, my first tenure track position. So I'm an assistant professor, and then you go up for tenure after 5-6 years. And so my year, I'll be going up next year at Morehouse, yeah, to be promoted. Yes.
When you do your research for the book, are you going to explore why that is, the level of depression, the suicide? Okay, because that is I'd never thought of it before you said that. Of course, you're right.
Yeah.
why is a fascinating question.
Absolutely. And I think really one of the things that, as I've been doing my background research, because I've been researching, comedians, the history of some of the comedians. So I'm talking about Moms Mabley, Freddie Prinze Jr., Margaret Cho, some of the, Henry Cho, the individuals that were the groundbreakers of their time. And when you go and you hear their biographies, and it's really very sad stories, not all of them, but many of them, Freddie Prinze Jr. Committed suicide, right? And so I think one of the things that, I think that humor is what helped them get through all those really hard times. That's what I'm starting to kind of see, is that it's a humor that was, I don't want to say healing, but it was able for them to give voice to whatever it is that they were experiencing. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. I had a wonderful time. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, well, I want to thank everybody for attending Authors and Dessert in Duluth. Thank you to Professor Marisela Martinez-Cola for this wonderful presentation. Thank you for bringing to light, I think, a history that we didn't know, these building blocks to Brown versus Board, and I think that definitely has affected our modern day education system. So thank you so much, Professor. If you haven't already purchased the Professor's book, we do still have some copies available, and you're welcome to purchase those. Thank you again for coming tonight. Thank you.